me just try this. You just bear with me. A portion of the screen, actually. Oh dear. Okay, just a second. No, this is not what I wanted. Slideshow and presenter view. Okay, can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, good. So this paper is part of a larger study to analyze how the pre-modern Śrīvaiṣṇava Ācāryas explained and interpreted the Āļvār's words and embedded them in their writings, thoughts, beliefs, in their very beings, actually. And the focus here is more on how this process takes place in two different genres, namely commentaries and hagiography, because I'd like to see if there are any differences in the way this is done, and if so, why, and with what consequences. So we'll actually look here at how two roughly contemporary Śrīvaiṣṇava Ācāryas understood and in turn presented Tirumaḻicai Āڵvār, who was quite different from the other Āļvārs, I think. Before I proceed, I think it's worth remembering here that the dates, authorships, and identities of the people and the works mentioned here have been questioned, but they actually don't matter here for the present study, which is more interested in knowing how a text was received by a certain set of people at a later point in time. So, and what they made of it. So here's how I plan to proceed. I'll first of all read a few apparently irreverent, provocative verses by this Āļvār, and then move on and see how the commentator Piriyachan Pillai reacts to them, how he explains them. And then finally, I'll have a look at what the hagiographer makes of those verses, if he differs from his contemporary, or not so contemporary, depending on what you see there, on his colleague's take on how he interprets the verses. So before we move on, I think I should say a few words on Tirumaḻicai Āļvār. I presume everybody knows him, so I won't get into any details. I think he was one of the younger contemporaries of the first three Āļvārs, probably 7th century, later 6th, 7th centuries. That's how that's where I would place him. And although he was influenced, he wasn't definitely influenced by them, but his temperament was quite different from theirs. We can see that Nilakantha Shastri, the eminent historian, calls him controversial. We'll see why. Probably because he was quite outspoken against those who seemingly differed from him. People like, for example, who practiced other religions, other deities like Shiva, etc. And he's also very different from most of his successors like Piriyarva and Nammarva. For example, he doesn't pine for God and he doesn't get overly emotional, for example. His bhakti is more like an intellectual kind of bhakti. He speaks a lot about meditating and knowing God, as we'll see a bit later on. Two works have been attributed to him. So that's the Nanmuhan Tiruvandadi and the Tiruchanda Viruttam, and I'll be quoting from both of them. So let's begin with a verse that criticizes the others. Ariyar Samanar, Ayartar Bautar, Siryar Sivapattar, Sippil, Viriyaya, Mayavanai, Malavanai, Madavanai, Etar, Inavare, Adala, Linjir. So the Jains are ignorant, the Buddhists are confused. To tell the truth, those who have fallen for Shiva are lower still. Those who do not praise the fragrant dark lord, Madhava, are therefore base people now. So the verse is, I think, self-explanatory, and I shan't dwell on it. So basically, those who don't worship Narayana are lowly. That's his firm conclusion. So I guess this sort of anti-heretical impulse was common for that time, as you well know. We can see that in verses by his Shaiva counterparts, like Sambandar, 7th century, presumably his contemporary. However, Tirumaļicai does seem to pick out Shiva for belittling him, like in this part of the verse. I'll just read the translation. Mine is not a scattered mind. I rival Shiva, but he's no match for me, he says. But again, the words are self-explanatory. He claims to be greater than Shiva. It usually doesn't get more aggressive or more belittling than this. Well, one might think that this kind of provocative verses would be reserved for Shiva or other gods or humans, but Tirumaļicai actually does not spare, I think, Narayana either, whom he considers the supreme God. Let's have a look at one such verse. Is there anyone equal to me? Our Lord is his own equal, but not mine. O you with the hue of ironwood flowers from the uplands, the others do not know you. Is the entire sky a suitable prize for my mind? Those who know Poiga Āļvār know that the first two lines have been taken from Poigai Āڵvār's Mudal Tiruvanda, the 89. But there you go, that's not the point here. The point here is that he says that because he knows God, which is a motif that comes back again and again in his work, there is no one to equal him, let alone surpass him. And he also places God and himself in two different categories, of which they are the best specimens. That's quite an overconfident poet that you have there, and who's quite sure of his devotion, but perhaps also of his power as a poet. Some of the Sangam poets are known, to feel that kind of power. If I remember, if we have the time, I'll come back to this later on. Now, let's have a look at another verse in which Tirumaļicai goes a step further to show his cheekiness, but this also, I think, betrays his closeness to God. Whether it comes today or tomorrow or be slightly delayed now, your grace is mine. Look, O Narayana, I indeed do not exist without you, but you do not exist without me either. So in the first two lines, we feel an unmissable sense of entitlement on the poet's part. He knows he deserves his grace, perhaps more than anyone else, because he knows what he is and because he knows what God is. In the next two lines, Tirumaļicai expresses a certain mutual need, a mutual dependence for their existence. Because without a devotee, God is not God. He cannot be God. So it is right that God and devotee are mutually dependent in a way. And in that sense, there's a certain equality between them. And I think that despite the cheekiness, Tirumaļicai speaks in this way because he feels urimai, what we call urimai in Tamil, vis-a-vis God, which is privilege of intimacy, as the Tamil lexicon translates it, liberty on the ground of friendship. Now, this kind of self-confidence, you can call this overconfidence if you want, pushes Tirumaļicai to be peeved at not being received properly by the deity in Tirukudandai, modern-day Kumbakonam. And this is what he says to the deity, who's not moving or getting up to receive him. Nadanda kalgal nundavo, nadungunyalame namai, idandame kulungavo, vilangumal varechuram, kadanda kal paranda ka virikkarai kudandayul, kidandavar irindirin the pesuvari kesane. I'm not going to read the whole translation, just the bits in blue. So he's asking him, did the feet that walked hurt? Was the body shaken? Rise from your reclining posture in Kudandai and speak. May you prosper, O Keshava. So Tirumaļicai wonders aloud why the reclining iconic Lord did not get up to greet him properly. Was it due to overexertion? And he orders him to get up and speak. We can see he's using the imperative. The final words of blessing can be also taken as being sarcastic. You don't want to be doing it? Fine. Go ahead. Fine. Bless you or whatever. And maybe not very natural in English, but like nalaire, as we would say in Tamil. So Tirumaļicai's confidence comes, of course, from a place of affection and urimai, which can be felt here in this verse. And this kind of cheeky verses for God do seem rather rare before his time, although we do find quite a few after him, like Tirumangai or Sundara, for example. So we have now seen a few irreverent verses by Tirumaļicai, now which sound like words of an overconfident devotee who's sure of his intimacy with God and knows that he won't offend God and wouldn't care if he did. Now we shall see what the Śrīvaiṣṇava Ācāryas make of him and his words a few centuries later. Now, the Śrīvaiṣṇava Ācāryas composed commentaries that are theological in nature on the Āļvār's poetry since Ramanuja's time, that is roughly 12th century, although he himself didn't compose any. And the practice of composing hagiographic works began around the same time. And for both genres, the highly Sanskritized Tamil called Manipravala was preferred, though not exclusively, but I won't get into that. Both works attributed to Tirumaļicai have been commented upon by Periyavachan Pillai, a very prolific 13th century commentator. And apparently his co-disciple, and probably also his disciple, called Pinbarahe Perumaljiyer, also narrates his life story in his Guru Parampara Prabhavam, Arayarapadi Guru Parampara Prabhavam. I'll just use the abbreviation GPP from now on, for obvious reasons. And let's see now how these two people interpret some of Tirumaļicai's statements, especially to begin with Periyavachan Pillai. This verse on the heretics that we read before, well, I'm not going to read the passage in Manipravala, there's no time for that, but let's have a look at the translation. I'll only read the bits in blue once again. So here's what how Periyavachan Pillai glosses this. The Arhatas do not know the truth as it is. The Buddhists, too, are futile in knowing the truth. Even those associated with Rudra Shiva are lowly. And then finally, conclusion, they are lowly people. Now, Pillai, I think, clearly follows Tirumaļicai, although he adds extra information when necessary to explain why Tirumaļicai must have rejected their beliefs. He gives because each time. So the commentator goes in the same direction as the poet when the poet criticizes other deities and their followers. Now, how about when Tirumaļicai becomes cheeky with Narayana himself? What does he do? Does he do the same thing? So we have seen this verse in which Tirumaļicai comes across as rather proud, even arrogant, when he says, well, who's my equal? God is his own equal, not mine. So this is how Periyavachan Pillai comments upon it. Emperuman rakshakan endrikira enakku oruttar edurundo Ishwaran thanakku oruvan rakshakan undendru iramayale avanum enakku oppandrum. So basically what he says is there anyone equal to me who consider God as my protector? Because the Supreme Being does not have a protector for him, he is not equal to me either. Now, what does this mean? I think it's pretty straightforward. In case that's not as straightforward, what it means is, like, first of all, we can see that Pillai adds two clauses here in blue, marked in blue here, to explain why Tirumaļicai and God do not have equals. First of all, the Āļvār has God himself as his protector, so there's no one to equal him. But God lacks a protector. Well, obviously, God doesn't need a protector, does he? But still, that's a lack. And because he has a lack, he's not equal to Tirumaļicai. So Pillai seems to want to make sure that people do not mistake Tirumaļicai as being proud and disrespectful towards God. Maybe he's that. But the commentator tries to make sure that people don't read it that way. And the following, and going another step, we are moving from the 13th to the 20th century. Another Acharya, very renowned scholar, P.B. Annangaracharya from the 20th century, he explains that this actually is Sattvika Ahankara, which is good pride. He says, if Ahankaram heyamandra, upadheyamam, Sattvika Ahankaram yenapadam. So this I-ness, this pride is not bad. It is acceptable. It is called Sattvika pride. He implies that this is different from the kind of pride that affects lesser mortals like ourselves, as it stems from association with God himself. So in one way or another, both commentators seem to explain away the perceived arrogance of Tirumaļicai in the verse above. I think it's very clear that they do so in good faith. They must truly believe that the Āļvār had this kind of Sattvika Ahankara, which can be and which should be explained satisfactorily into that. But it's also true that they can't possibly have an Āļvār display negative qualities, and pride is one, and thus set a bad example, as people will probably pick up his arrogance, but not his devotion. So they explain away his words by suggesting interpretations that are more theological in nature than the more straightforward ones, that are the most obvious ones as well. Another verse, but I think Pillai's interpretation is very similar. It's even more interesting, but I don't think I'll have the time to get into this. Suffices to say that Pillai presumes once again that the original verse is elliptical and loaded with unexpressed meanings, and therefore supplies extra words in blue here. Not just, I haven't put in blue everything, but the most important ones here. And for all intents and purposes, modifies the original meaning in the process, at least a little, if not a lot. So here too, I have a feeling that Pillai is making sure that Tirumaļicai comes across as saying the right thing, even when he's not, or perhaps especially when he's not. So in a way, I think his voice has been tamed. So this other verse in which Tirumaļicai orders God, the deity in Kumbakonam to rise, very similar interpretation, because Pillai thinks that these are genuine questions of concern. Because he asked, are you really tired? And then he says, would you like me to press your feet? Would you like to press your body? And then Pillai also suggests that he's asking him to get up and speak to make sure that he's all right. So this is great concern. And Pillai actually uses the term parivu here. I haven't given it here. And parivu means affection, an affection of an emotional kind. But the thing is, I would rather associate this with Periyavachan, whom the Acharyas say has the pungu parivu, overflowing affection, because that's an Āļvār who's emotional and who's worried about Krishna's safety and well-being. I really don't think that Tirumaļicai would fit the bill. He's so fiery, and I don't think he thinks that God needs that kind of concern. But of course, I might be wrong. Now, to conclude the second part, before we move on, I think, of course, when dealing with a text, we can interpret it. We, the reader, can interpret it the way we want to, whether the author intended a certain interpretation, meaning or not. That's the reader's right. I believe in that. And the same goes for Pillai's theological explanations. But I just think that when something doesn't quite fit the theological framework while passing through the commentator's lens, it is turned into something proper. Okay, anyway, let's move on to the last part and see how the Āļvār comes across when seen through the lens of the hagiographer. And let's see especially if there are any fundamental differences in the way that Tirumaļicai's words are interpreted in that genre. Okay, before we proceed, I think that in a way that is reminiscent of Mark Twain, the hagiographers never let the truth get in the way of a good story, as you know, especially when facts are scarce, which is the case with the Āļvārs. And it seems to me that the hagiographers' first source is the words of the Āļvārs themselves. Let's have a look. So much so that sometimes they even quote their verses in red here. I have given it in red, for example. We just read Ariyar Samanar Ayattar. Though the hagiographers don't directly reflect upon those verses the way that commentators do, it's not their job, it's not part of the genre. Anyway, let's see what Jir in this case makes of Tirumaļicai's words. Let's begin with Tirumaļicai's fight for the other belief systems and what Jir does with it. So there is this passage in the GPP. I'll only read, it's very long, as you can see, I'll only read the bits in blue, which explains what Tirumaļicai does in his life. So this is his life story. Having entered the heterodox systems and the systems with a wrong understanding of the Vedas, since there was no substance at all in them, his interest in them ceased. He became a Śrīvaiṣṇava, strictly observant of the Vedic doctrine. So we can see that the GPP follows Tirumaļicai's words, which are quoted, as I said, in this extract of the GPP, which I've given in red here. And it also expands upon those words by giving details on the different belief systems and actually suggesting further belief systems. And it also suggests a context, a story. There's a background story for his claim. Whatever he says in his verse, there's a story here. It means that he tested many different belief systems and then realized they're no good, and he finally settled for Vaishnavism. And I think it's a story that fits very, very well in this context. Now let's see what Jir does about Tirumaļicai's stated superiority over Shiva. Okay, there's no direct explanation of the verse that we read initially, in which he says that Shiva is no rival to him. But there is a story in the GPP that could explain Tirumaļicai's statement, how it is narrated, how it is turned into a story in the GPP. I'm only going to give you the gist of the story because it runs into many, many pages of mostly was single sentence that runs into many pages with graphic descriptions. So here's the story. The Tirumaļicai refuses to honor Shiva, who gets offended. So he opens his third eye on his forehead and opens fire, actually. And as a response, the Āļvār opens a bigger fire from his third eye, which is located on his big toe. And of course, his fire is greater and he subdues Shiva. Now here I have a feeling that what was just a few mentions in Tirumaļicai's works about Shiva being an inferior, not just to Narayana, but to himself, who was a devotee of Narayana, are taken literally in the hagiography. And the anti-Shiva rhetoric gets illustrated with such a story. So ideas, seeds, flower into stories in the hagiographies. Let's now move on to Tirumaļicai's cheeky verses to Narayana himself to see how the GPP deals with them. Does it modify Tirumaļicai's personality so that he comes across as a wise, loving devotee? Let's see. Once again, there is this story, Kanikandan's story. There's no one-to-one parallel. You know, there's no one verse that corresponds to one story here, nothing clear-cut, but there's something very interesting happening in the story in the GPP. Okay, let me tell you very quickly. So it involves Tirumaḻicai Āḻvār's disciple Kanikannan, and when they were living in Tiruvikka near Kanchipuram, Tirumaļicai turns an old woman who served him into a young woman. And the Pallava king marries her and then learns the truth of her youth. And he approaches Kanikannan, asks him to speak to his master so that he could turn the king young again. Kanikannan refuses. The king banishes him, as you can see on that picture. And Tirumaļicai decides to accompany his disciple. And according to the GPP, Tirumaļicai uttered this following verse to the main deity in Tiruvikka. Kanikannan pohindran, kamaru pookachi manivanna, nee kidakka venda. Tunivudaya senna pulavanum pohindren, neeyum undran paina happai churuttikol. By the way, we don't really know who composed these verses. They could be floating verses. They could have been composed by the author of the GPP, whoever it was. If it was Jia, then maybe it was him. We don't really know. Anyway, the translation is, Kanikannan is leaving, O Safayu Lord from beautiful, desirable Kanchi, do not lie here. I, a bold poet with a tongue of integrity. See, we are getting back to this power of the poet. I'm also leaving. So you too roll up your hooded cobra mat, he says. So the poet orders God to follow him and is obeyed according to the story. And the king's city plunges into darkness as a result. So the king catches up with Kanikannan and begs him to return. So Tirumaļicai tweaks the same verse a little bit. It's in red here. He basically says, oh, Kanikannan is not going anymore, nor am I. So you come back and lie down here. So the story is that God comes back again and lies down, but in the opposite direction, in a reverse reclining posture, as you can see here, to mark the event so that people remember it. So that's the story in the GPP. So we can feel from the story that the devotee and God are friends, equals, just as Tirumaļicai suggested in his verse that we read earlier on. In fact, I even think that there's an inversion of supremacy, as the devotee assumes a higher position, gives orders to God, and is obeyed. Exactly like in the verse that we read when he asks the deity in Kumbakonam to get up. So I think that this story is based on a handful of such verses of the poet, but perhaps on the spirit, on the personality of the Āḻvār in general. And it shows me how well the Śrīvaiṣṇava hagiographers grasped Tirumaļicai's personality and didn't hesitate to advertise that, to illustrate stories that bring out his character, unlike the more reluctant commentator. So I think it's time to conclude. I've been going on for a while now. I think Tirumaļicai's fiery verses are somewhat tamed by the commentator, who makes it conform to a certain set of moral values and theological framework and other things, perhaps. However, the hagiographer, even though he's unsurprisingly hyperbolic whenever he narrates something, grasps and expresses Tirumaļicai's personality better. And he renders the way Tirumaļicai sounds in his poetry more accurately. You know, he's loyal, confident, brave, and straightforward. And we can feel that in the stories. So perhaps the genre decides how Tirumaļicai's words were interpreted by these Ācāryas. Well, of course, exegetical material are a higher pramana, meaning they are a higher, superior source of authoritative evidence. So that whatever it says needs to have been carefully considered beforehand. So perhaps that's why Tirumaļicai comes out as a loving, caring devotee rather than the spirited, proud Āḻvār who even ordered God. This side is not completely erased because it is maintained when he speaks about Shiva and other deities, etc., but not when he addresses God. Whereas hagiographies are more free. It's an entirely different matter. They have an important role as well, that of teaching, perhaps to a different audience, a less erudite audience, by means of stories of exemplary people, like the Puranas did and still do, rather than by means of fully fledged theological works like commentaries, which are less accessible. So the narration could be a little more feisty, with scope for hyperboles. And although the audience is taught lessons through them, they're not, I think, encouraged to emulate the Āḻvārs in everything. For example, the story of Tirumaļicai opening fire on Shiva, that's not possible for you and I. But the lesson that you derive from it is that devotees are greater than Shiva and other deities. So there you go. So I think this is fascinating. These are some of the hypotheses of this fascinating material that I've been working on for many years now. So I hope to work dig more into them in order to gain more insights, because I really find this fascinating. Well, thanks so much for listening. And I hope you enjoyed Tirumaḻicai as much as I did and do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suganya. So a few minutes are left for questions.